On May 3, 2011, the Canadian Forces Postal Service will be celebrating its 100th anniversary of providing postal service to the men and women who have proudly served Canada both domestically and overseas. Even though the CPC was officially stood up in 1911, there are accounts of postal services being provided to troops in Canada as far back as when French and British troops were stationed in Canada during the 16th to 18th centuries, to the War of 1812, and the Northwest Rebellion. Postal has, in fact, played an important role in troops' morale and their ability to communicate with loved ones back home during every major campaign in the past, as well as modern operations in Afghanistan. When the Canadian militia was first stood up in 1869 after Confederation, troops were to use civil post except during summer training camps or if they were on active service. The Northwest and Red River Rebellions in 1869 was to be the first time the Canadian government mounted a military force.
On 25 May 1870, Mr. Stanley Green set up a mail service for the militia that was carried by lake steamer to his office in Prince Arthur, near present-day Thunder Bay, Ontario, where he sorted and dispatched to the Army by whatever means at his disposal. This included using the Hudson's Bay Company and local Indigenous people. In 1885, the government mobilized the Northwest Field Office for the campaign against Louis Riel in the Second Northwest Rebellion, and a post office was established in Swift Current for the service some 5,000 troops. This time a line of carriers with relays of ponies and wagon teams was set up to transport the mail.
The Boer War in South Africa was to be another test for the new Canadian militia in 1899 for 1,000 plus troops.
The Canadian government offered to send along a postal detachment with the first contingent of troops, but the offer was declined by the British. However, when the second contingent was dispatched aboard the Laurentian from Halifax on 21 January 1900, Lieutenant W.R. Eccleston had under his command Sergeant Rowan Johnston, Private Thomas B. Bedell, Private Joseph Lallier, and Private Kenneth A. Murray, forming the first postal detachment to serve outside of Canada. All were ex-railway mail clerks. On 31st January 1900, after a stop in the Cape Verde Islands off the coast of Senegal, Africa, an exchange of letters had thus become the first mail dispatched by a Canadian postal detachment.
Shortly after arrival, 2 offices were established in Cape Town and Bloemfontein to serve the Canadian militia and assist British forces.
On the 4th of June 1900, newly promoted Sergeant Murray wired a message from Pretoria to Cape Town, asking to forward up the mail. This became the first information received at Cape Town that British forces were successful at entering Pretoria and defeating the local Boer forces north of the town. On the 20th of January 1901, the postal detachment was dispatched back to Canada from Cape Town with the rest of the Canadian troops. The postal detachment was disbanded, only to be recalled in October 1901 for a short time to provide postal services in Toronto for a royal visit by the Duke and Duchess of Cornwall.
After the Boer War, the military postal service was only utilized during summer training months, and soon field post offices, or FPOs, were to be opened in camps at Niagara, Petawawa, and Aldershot. The first was Camp Niagara on 16 June 1909, with the others opening later in 1910. The Canadian Military Postal Service can trace its seniority from General Order 70 on the 3rd of May 1911. This order authorized the formation within the Canadian militia of a Canadian Postal Corps. This order detailed a base post office to be stood up in Toronto, commanded by Major George Ross, with detachments in London, Kingston, Montreal, Quebec, Halifax, Winnipeg, and Calgary.
Most of the first officers were civilian postal officials enlisting in the newly created Canadian Postal Corps, with the re-enlisting of Lieutenant Murray and Captain Eccleston from the South African campaign. The Director of Postal Services was a regular Service Corps officer, Colonel J.L. Bigger. On 18 April 1912, a design for the Canadian Postal Corps badge was approved, and General Order 175 was then published authorizing the design. However, there is no evidence that the badge was ever worn by CPC personnel during World War I.
War had broken out in 1914, and the Canadian militia was called into service. When the first contingent arrived on 14 October 1914, a CPC detachment was present and set up shop on the Salisbury Plain, awaiting transfer to France. In February 1915, Lieutenant Murray deployed to France with 13 postal clerks.
Soon there was an additional 20,000 troops arriving from Canada, and the current system was to be inadequate. Offices in London and smaller ones around England were established, as well as an office dealing specifically with casualty mail. At one point, 50,000 Canadian troops were being served by the CPC.
Our first deployment consisted of 1 NCO and 2 men with each brigade and divisional train. A divisional railhead post office was set up and a postal detail was attached to the supply column to convey our mail to the forward lines. The railhead soon moved into Ypres before the second battle, and we had to endure gas attacks for the first time. However, we proved successful in the battle and in our duties.
Soon the CPC was to suffer its first casualty, Sergeant W.H. Hilton. He was severely wounded by shell fire, while another, Corporal L.J. Power, was suffering from shell shock while employed in the Somme area. During August 1918, the Canadian and British forces pushed ahead, sometimes moving twice a day. A plan to send mail up with rations proved to be tremendously successful. Soon the push into Germany taxed the mail system to the max, with destroyed infrastructure and Christmas season in full swing. To meet the situation, all available lorries were put into service to deliver the mail. During the march to the Rhine, Sergeant A.H. Hamill from the 4th Canadian Brigade contracted pneumonia and soon afterward died.
The war continued on many fronts, and one of the forgotten deployments was Siberia, where the CPC was front and center, as always.
In 1918, the Canadian government decided to send some 4,000 troops to Vladivostok, Russia, following the collapse of the Eastern Front during the Russian Revolution. The CPC set up an office and after some initial problems was ready to serve troops, with the main body arriving in January 1919. The office was manned by 4 posties during these months and was closed on the 27th of May 1919.
At the end of the war, CPC was manned by 4 officers, 44 NCOs, and 108 men employed in 31 Canadian post offices.
Lieutenant General Sir Arthur Currie, commander of the Canadian Corps, was quoted at the end of the war about the CPC. Before the Canadian Corps breaks up, I would like to place on record my appreciation for the most efficient work done by the Canadian Postal Service during all the weary months of the war.
At the completion of the war, the CPC was reduced in numbers and primarily used to provide postal services in militia summer training camps. In 1939, war broke out again in Europe and the CPC would again be mobilized. November 1939 seen the creation of the first base post office in Ottawa to train personnel for overseas units, as well as to sort and dispatch mail to Europe. Over the course of the war, 162 military and Navy post offices would be set up domestically and numerous establishments overseas, including Army post offices and tobacco depots.
Mail was routed overseas by all means possible, including ship, aircraft, and merchant marines. In 1942, a Royal Canadian Air Force Postal Service was formed, and airmail flights were soon in place to speed up the delivery. At the time, shipment of mail by sea could take up to 3 weeks to reach England. One of the most memorable of these units was formed in 1943 as 168 Squadron and was dubbed the Mail Can Squadron. To assist the general public, a fictional Private John Doe was created to educate the public on how to address letters to the troops overseas. This must have caused some confusion as some 1,000 plus letters started to arrive addressed to Private John Doe.
In late 1941, 5 posties were sent with Force C to Hong Kong, including Staff Sergeant C.A. Clark.
On 19 November 1941, Staff Sergeant Clark set up a field post office in China Command and opened for business in time for the busy Christmas season, with 5 other CPC members under his command. However, on the 25th of December, Christmas Day, word came about that the garrison was captured by the Japanese, and Staff Sergeant Clark and his men were POWs for the next 4 years. During his imprisonment, he was able to successfully hide 2 brass canisters and started a fire at the Nippon Koken shipyards where he was held. starting a fire that greatly crippled the Japanese war effort for 8 months at the shipyard, and for his valor under fire for assisting men and officers in need during their capture, he was awarded the Distinguished Conduct Medal.
Members of the Canadian military have served in many areas of the world, including Europe, Asia, North Africa, Australia, India, Iceland, the Azores, and British West Indies, and the CPC delivered to them all.
The average number of letters per month per soldier in 1942 was 10 letters, resulting in 35 million pieces of mail being sent overseas that year. A free mail system was devised for troops to send mail home to Canada, but was restricted to a weight of less than 2 ounces. Also in 1942, to save weight and space on aircraft, the Forces Air Letter was introduced and is still used to this day.
During the course of the war, we received all kinds of funny letters that caused us a lot of extra work. I would spend hours checking one letter, such as Private Maybe, Leo Laffel, Cavalry, I think, Camp something, England. I met a man named Sergeant Pilot J. Morris, who told me that he opened a parcel from home and discovered a pair of ice skates which had followed him to England, then on to South Africa, and finally reached him back in Europe. He told me the CPC were like the Mounties, that we always get our man.
Following D-Day, 8 members of the CPC with 2 vehicles set up postal operations at 0600 hours on 7 June 1944 in Normandy. And as the Army progressed, FPOs attached to units were constantly on the move to keep pace with the advance.
At the end of the war, the CPC saw its numbers grow to 5,080 officers, men and members of the Canadian Women's Army Corps, and RCAF's Women's Division. 19 fatal casualties were reported during World War II.
As with the end of the Great War, World War II saw the CPC disbanded in 1946, and postal was regulated to a reserve force. Most of the CPC members returned to their peacetime jobs they had held at the Canada Post Office Department. On the 1st of November 1950, the CPC was once again activated as a result of Canada sending troops into Korea. Offices in Tokyo and Vancouver were quickly set up and started to ferry mail to soldiers in Korea.
The mail service in place at the beginning of the Korean War had letters marked on active service and were forwarded for free to Curie via Tokyo for furtherance to Korea. The brigade commander at the time expressed his dissatisfaction with the service and suggested a direct route from Tokyo to Seoul via U.S. facilities. A trial period was started on the 5th of March 1954 for 1 month and proved so successful that the 1st Canadian Communications Zone Postal Unit had to move from Curie to Tokyo. 35 posties were employed to provide service to the Canadian troops who were serving in all areas of the campaign.
Post-war Europe, NATO, and the United Nations were dramatically evolving the role of Canada's military and its role within the world community. CPC was soon to have offices throughout Europe, serving Canadian Forces members and families.
In October 1953, No. 1 Canadian Overseas Postal Depot arrived in London and set up shop. His first mission was to open a Canadian Army Post Office, 5053, to serve Canadians working at the Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe in Paris. The CPC had numerous offices in such places as Werl, Iserlohn, Trier, Metz, Zweibrücken, and Soest, along with Paris and London and others. And in 1957, under the RCAF, Capo 5056 was opened in Baden, Germany. On the 1st of January 1965, all Capo were renamed Canadian Forces Post Office, or CFPOs, along with all 2- and 3-digit field post offices. In 1968, after an almost 50% cut in strength, it was decided that the entire Soest area would be closed and moved to Lahr in southern Germany, and CFPO 5000 was opened and ready along with CFPOs 105 and 108.
In Canada, the Post Office Department was undergoing a substantial change since the end of the war and did not feel responsible for military post offices. The CPC could then open MPOs as deemed necessary to provide support to Canadian Forces personnel.
In 1952, Colonel G.W. Ross, OBE-VD, became the Director of Armed Forces Postal Services. Also during this period, a new numbering system was devised for the CPC units in Canada. All officers in the Atlantic provinces were numbered starting with 100. This continued westward with Quebec as 200, Ontario as 300, Prairie provinces were 400, Alberta with 500, and British Columbia 600. In 1954, Lieutenant Colonel T. Bond became a Director of Armed Forces Postal Services until 1956. In 1963, now Colonel T. Bond became the first only Colonel Commandant of the Postal Corps until 1972. Colonel Bond's wife, Joan, has retained her ties with the Postal Service throughout the years and is considered today as the First Lady of Postal.
October 1956 seen fighting start in the Sinai at the Suez Canal, and soon after, the UN General Assembly authorized the first United Nations emergency force. Thus began Canada's involvement in international peacekeeping.
Canadians pride themselves on their ability of peacekeeping. Canada has been part of every major peacekeeping operation since the Sinai in 1956, and the CF Postal Services has been there with them. Peacekeeping operations including the Congo, Cyprus, India, Pakistan, Israel, Syria, Lebanon, Iran, Iraq, Namibia, and the Golan Heights. And the CPC was right there serving its troops. In fact, most of the posties serving in the 80s and 90s would have rotated through Golan Heights or Cyprus during their career. On 29 May 1964, Private R.L. Morin of the RCPC lost his life in an accident in Egypt, the only postie to be killed during a UN operation.
In 1961, the CPC celebrated its golden anniversary with units located in Britain, France, Germany, Sardinia, Egypt, Lebanon, Congo, and of course, in Canada.
To celebrate its 50th anniversary on the 30th of June 1961, Queen Elizabeth II bestowed the title of Royal to the CPC, effecting a name change to the Royal Canadian Postal Corps. Over the years, more changes were to come to the structure of the RCPC, with offices opening in Sydney, Nova Scotia, Chatham, Alert, along with MPOs on trains for Canada's Centennial, and even an MPO on Canada's aircraft carrier, HMCS Bonaventure. In 1963, No. 1 Canadian Base Post Office was closed in Montreal, with an air terminal moved to its current location at CFB Trenton. In 1967, with reunification of the forces, the base post office in Trenton became the new Canadian Home Postal Depot and later changed names again in 1975 to be called the Canadian Forces Postal Unit. The 70s seen dramatic changes to the RCPC. In 1974, the RCPC was absorbed by the administration branch, and all 33 admin clerks serving in central registries were transferred to postal, and the RCPC badge was abolished.
1981 seen one of the largest multi-formation exercises in decades on Canadian soil, when some 9,000 soldiers moved into CFB Gagetown for Rendezvous 81. 24 posties went on this exercise to provide postal support.
In 1981, not only did we see RV-81, but this was the year of the publication of the first Posthorn magazine. This publication continues to be a valuable source of news and entertainment for posties to this very day.
1986 seen the postal trade turn 75 years old, and on the 9th of May, Canada Post released a stamp commemorating this historic event. Events were held in various locations such as Halifax, Ottawa, and units in Europe. The main event was held at CFPU Trenton. We also see the first annual CFPU All-Ranks Mess Dinner take place on the 5th of June. Shortly after the 75th anniversary, the Canadian Forces Postal Branch was authorized, and on the 1st of January 1987, posties once again had their identity.
The proud, newly formed Canadian Forces Postal Branch had once again adopted the posthorn as its symbol and incorporated this into the new badge along with the motto, Quo Officium Compellit, meaning where duty calls.
13 years later, changes again came to postal, as the postal branch was amalgamated into the logistic branch in January 2000. As a result, all posties now wear the logistic branch cap badge. The latest changes to the Canadian Forces Postal Service came as part of CF transformation, where a number of new commands stood up to enhance military and operational capabilities and coordination. One such command is the Canadian Operational Support Command, or CNOSCOM, whose mission is to provide effective and efficient operational support to CF operations, be they domestic, continental, or expeditionary.
As part of transformation, the CFPS, specifically the old J4 post, found a new home as part of CANOSCOM. Also, the CF Postal Unit found a new home as part of Canadian Forces Joint Support Group, a rapidly deployable formation under CANOSCOM, which provides and coordinates operational level support to CF international and domestic operations. Considering the primary function of the CFPS is to provide postal support to all deployed CF forces at home and abroad, the addition of Postal to these two operationally focused organizations made complete sense. This transition has proven to be extremely beneficial to Postal's capability to conduct operations.
As we can see, the long and proud history of the Canadian Forces Postal Service has been one of never failing to answer the call of duty despite continual change in size, structure, and chain of command. This has been true in the past, the present, and most likely in the future. However, despite all of these changes and those to come, it has never been the hat badge, the branch, or the command that has defined us as posties. It has always been and always will be the role we play in helping maintain the morale of deployed troops by providing that vital link between CF members and their families during operations.